There was a time when capitalism seemed unstoppable. It transformed the world, lifted millions out of poverty, and brought about technological advancements that reshaped human civilization. The free market was praised as the ultimate engine of progress, rewarding innovation, hard work, and competition. But beneath the surface of prosperity, cracks were always present, cracks that have widened into deep fractures in recent decades. Rising inequality, economic instability, and the growing disillusionment of entire generations signal that something is fundamentally wrong. For many, the promise of capitalism, the idea that anyone can succeed through effort and talent, has turned into a myth. Wages stagnate while the cost of living rises. Home ownership, once the cornerstone of the middle-class dream, is out of reach for millions. Wealth accumulates in the hands of a shrinking elite, while the working class struggles under increasing financial pressure. And as corporations chase ever higher profits, environmental destruction accelerates, communities crumble, and the gap between rich and poor becomes insurmountable. This isn't the first time an economic system has reached a breaking point. Throughout history, civilizations have risen and fallen, often due to economic models that became unsustainable. Just as feudalism collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiencies, capitalism too may be heading toward an inevitable transformation. Even its strongest supporters now admit that capitalism, at least in its current form, is facing a crisis. The pursuit of infinite growth in a world with finite resources is an impossible equation. Automation and artificial intelligence are beginning to replace human labor, disrupting the fundamental structure of employment. Climate change, a byproduct of unchecked corporate greed, forces us to rethink the sustainability of an economy driven by consumption and exploitation. Some argue that capitalism can be reformed, that new regulations, wealth redistribution, or sustainable business models could fix its worst excesses. Others believe that the system is beyond saving, that we are already in the early stages of a post-capitalist world. The real question is no longer whether capitalism will change, but how, when, and what comes next. Capitalism's greatest strength has always been its ability to adapt. From industrial revolutions to global financial crises, it has evolved, restructured, and found ways to maintain dominance. But every system has its limits, and capitalism's internal contradictions are becoming too large to ignore. The very forces that once propelled its success, competition, technological progress, and market expansion, are now accelerating its decline. One of the clearest signs of capitalism's crisis is the collapse of the middle class. Historically, a strong middle class has been the backbone of capitalist economies, ensuring a steady cycle of consumption, investment, and economic growth. But today, that foundation is eroding. Wages have stagnated for decades, while the cost of living has skyrocketed. Healthcare, education, and housing, once seen as basic pillars of a stable life, are increasingly unaffordable for the average worker. Meanwhile, wealth accumulates at the top, with billionaires amassing fortunes that entire nations struggle to generate. The result is a growing sense of disillusionment, particularly among younger generations who see fewer opportunities for economic mobility than their parents and grandparents had. At the same time, democracy itself is being eroded by capitalism's relentless hunger for profit. Governments, originally meant to serve the people, have become increasingly influenced, if not outright controlled, by corporate interests. The rise of lobbyists, unchecked campaign financing, and the privatization of essential services have blurred the line between political power and economic power. In theory, capitalism and democracy were supposed to complement each other. In reality, capitalism has steadily undermined democratic institutions, creating a world where economic influence determines political outcomes. When corporations have more power than elected leaders, the idea of a government for the people becomes an illusion. Another contradiction that threatens capitalism is its reliance on perpetual growth. The system is built on the assumption that economies must constantly expand, that companies must always increase profits, and that markets must always find new consumers. But infinite growth on a planet with finite resources is impossible. We are already witnessing the environmental consequences of this unsustainable model: deforestation, biodiversity loss, climate disasters, and a growing energy crisis, governments and corporations continue to push for economic expansion, even as scientific research makes it clear that our planet cannot sustain it. The longer we ignore this contradiction, the closer we edge toward ecological collapse. Adding to the instability is the rapid advancement of automation and artificial intelligence. For decades, capitalism thrived by exploiting labor, paying workers just enough to keep them productive, but not enough to challenge the existing power structures. But what happens when human labor is no longer necessary? As AI and robotics take over jobs in every industry, from manufacturing to finance, transportation to customer service, millions of workers are being pushed into economic uncertainty. Without meaningful employment, consumer spending collapses and capitalism begins to devour itself. This raises an urgent question. If jobs disappear and wealth remains concentrated at the top, who will be left to sustain the system? The tensions within capitalism are not just theoretical. We see them playing out in real time. Across the world, protests against wealth inequality, corporate greed, and political corruption are increasing. Trust in financial institutions is at an all-time low. The younger generation, raised in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash, is more skeptical of capitalism than any previous generation. Meanwhile, political leaders struggle to balance the demands of the corporate elite with the frustrations of an increasingly restless population. These contradictions cannot be resolved by simply tweaking the system. They demand a fundamental shift. The question is not whether capitalism will end, but what will replace it. Will we see a transition to a new economic model, one that prioritizes sustainability, equity, and human well-being? Or will we see the collapse of capitalism lead to chaos with no clear alternative in sight? As capitalism fractures under its own weight, the world stands at a crossroads. The old system is crumbling, but what comes next is still uncertain. Some believe we are on the verge of a technological utopia, where automation and artificial intelligence will free humanity from labor, allowing for universal basic income and a society driven by creativity and self-actualization. Others warn of a darker outcome, where corporate control intensifies, inequality reaches dystopian levels, and the global economy descends into chaos. The truth is, the future after capitalism is not predetermined. It will depend on the choices we make in the coming years. One possible transition is toward a more decentralized, cooperative-based economy. Thinkers like Karl Marx and Peter Kropotkin argued that capitalism's replacement would be a system in which wealth and power are more evenly distributed. In this vision, automation would not be used to consolidate corporate control, but to liberate people from meaningless labor. Instead of being dependent on corporations for employment, communities could function through shared ownership of essential industries, cooperative work structures, and localized production. We already see early signs of this shift in worker-owned businesses, decentralized finance, and open-source technology movements. If these ideas continue to gain traction, capitalism's successor could be a system in which economic power is no longer concentrated in the hands of a few, but shared more equitably among society. On the other hand, there is a far bleaker possibility: the entrenchment of what some call corporate feudalism. As wealth becomes more concentrated, billionaires and multinational corporations could effectively replace traditional governments, controlling everything from infrastructure to basic human necessities. This would create a two-tiered society, where the ultra-rich enjoy unprecedented privileges, while the majority live in a state of economic servitude. Already, we see glimpses of this in the growing influence of major tech companies, private cities designed for elites, and the increasing privatization of essential services like healthcare, water, and even law enforcement. If capitalism dies without a clear alternative in place, the vacuum could be filled by a system that looks less like democracy and more like digital feudalism, where the corporate elite dictate the rules of society. Yet another possibility is a controlled transition into what some call post-capitalism. Governments and economic theorists have long recognized the instability of the current system, and there are increasing discussions about how to implement structural changes without triggering collapse. Ideas such as universal basic income, shortened work weeks, and a move toward an economy that values social well-being over infinite growth are gaining traction. Thinkers like John Maynard Keynes predicted that capitalism would evolve into something new once automation reduced the need for human labor. The challenge, however, is whether governments can implement these changes before unrest forces them. History has shown that economic systems rarely transition smoothly. They often collapse before real alternatives take shape. But perhaps the most unpredictable factor is how human psychology will shape the end of capitalism. People are not just economic beings, they are emotional, ideological, and sometimes resistant to change, even when it is necessary. Many are deeply attached to the values capitalism promotes: competition, individualism, and the belief in meritocracy, even if those values no longer serve them. If capitalism ends, it will not be just an economic shift, but a profound cultural and psychological transformation. The way we define success, purpose, and identity will have to change. No longer will wealth accumulation be the primary marker of achievement. In a post-capitalist world, meaning may be found in creativity, contribution to the community, and personal fulfillment, rather than the relentless pursuit of financial gain. History is filled with economic systems that once seemed invincible, but eventually collapsed or transformed into something entirely different. From the fall of feudalism to the collapse of the Soviet Union, each major shift in human economic organization has followed a similar pattern. A system expands to its limits, crises become more frequent, and eventually something new takes its place. If capitalism is now entering its final phase, what can history teach us about what comes next? One of the clearest parallels is the decline of feudalism. For centuries, feudal societies were structured around rigid hierarchies, where landowners controlled wealth and peasants worked the land in exchange for protection. This system functioned well until it didn't. As cities grew, trade expanded, and new forms of wealth emerged, feudalism became increasingly unsustainable. The Black Plague accelerated this decline by wiping out vast portions of the labor force, giving workers newfound bargaining power. The old system could no longer sustain itself, and capitalism emerged from its ashes. Today, capitalism itself is facing similar pressures. Automation, climate change, and wealth concentration are creating conditions that may force a transition just as drastic as the one that ended feudalism. Another relevant example is the collapse of the Soviet economic system. While capitalism's rival communism was built on entirely different principles, it suffered from many of the same issues that now plague global capitalism: inefficiencies, lack of adaptability, and deepening inequality. When the cracks in the system became too large to ignore, it collapsed almost overnight. What followed was not a smooth transition, but a period of immense instability and economic hardship. This serves as a warning. If capitalism falls without a clear alternative in place, the consequences could be devastating. History shows that systems don't fade away quietly. They often collapse suddenly, leaving chaos in their wake. But history also provides lessons on how economic transitions can be managed. The Great Depression of the 1930s nearly led to the downfall of capitalism in the United States, but massive government intervention through the New Deal helped stabilize the system. Social safety nets were expanded, workers gained more rights, and the economy was restructured to prevent another catastrophic collapse. This suggests that if capitalism is to survive in any form, it must evolve. Universal basic income, shorter work weeks, and a shift away from endless consumption might be necessary adaptations to prevent a complete breakdown. The question is, who will control this transition? If history is any guide, the ruling elite will not give up their power without a fight. During the decline of feudalism, many lords and monarchs resisted change, clinging to their privileges until they were overthrown. During the fall of the Soviet Union, powerful figures within the system scrambled to privatize wealth, leading to the rise of oligarchs who still control much of Russia's economy today. If capitalism ends, the world's wealthiest individuals and corporations will likely attempt to shape its successor to benefit themselves. The battle over what comes next has already begun. Whether it will be a system of greater equality or one of even deeper control remains to be seen. This is why understanding the forces at play is so crucial. The end of capitalism is not just about economics. It is about power, ideology, and the way we structure society itself. The way we respond to these changes, whether we cling to the past or embrace new possibilities, will determine the kind of world we create. If capitalism is in its final stages, the most important question is not whether it will end, but what comes after. Will we transition into a system that promotes greater equality and sustainability, or will the collapse of capitalism lead to something even worse, greater economic instability, corporate control, or the rise of authoritarian regimes? The answer depends on whether we can rethink our relationship with money, labor, and value itself. One of the biggest problems with capitalism is that it has conditioned us to see growth as the ultimate goal. Every year, economies are expected to expand, corporations must increase their profits, and individuals are pushed to work harder, consume more, and climb the social ladder. But this pursuit of infinite growth is proving to be unsustainable, both for the planet and for human well-being. The most radical shift in a post-capitalist world might not be economic, it might be psychological. We may have to redefine success, moving away from material wealth and towards something deeper. Some thinkers propose that the future will be shaped by a post-scarcity economy, where automation, artificial intelligence, and technological advancements make most forms of traditional labor obsolete. In this scenario, universal basic income could replace wages, and work could become something people choose to do for personal fulfillment, rather than economic necessity. Others argue that decentralization will be the next phase. Small, self-sufficient communities using technology to produce their own goods, independent of corporate control. Instead of one global economy, we may see a network of smaller, localized economies. Of course, the transition will not be smooth. Historically, every major economic shift has been accompanied by a period of upheaval, conflict, and resistance. Those who benefit most from capitalism will fight to maintain their power, and new political struggles will emerge over how resources should be distributed. There is also the risk that if capitalism collapses without a clear alternative, we may see the rise of authoritarian systems that exploit the instability to consolidate power. Just as feudal lords once resisted capitalism's rise, today's billionaires and multinational corporations will likely use every tool at their disposal to ensure they remain in control. But there is reason for hope. As old systems break down, new ideas gain momentum. Alternative economic models are already being tested. Cooperative ownership, resource-based economies, and even digital currencies that operate outside of traditional banking structures. The internet has made it easier than ever for people to challenge existing power structures, build new communities, and spread revolutionary ideas. While capitalism may have shaped much of the modern world, it is not the end of history. The real challenge is whether we as individuals and as a society are ready to question the assumptions that have governed our lives for centuries. Can we imagine a world where success is not measured by consumption? Can we redefine work in a way that is not tied to survival? Can we build systems that prioritize well-being over profit? These are the questions that will determine what comes after capitalism. No economic system lasts forever. Capitalism, like feudalism before it, has served its purpose. It has created immense wealth, technological progress, and global interconnectedness, but now its contradictions are catching up to it. Whether its downfall leads to a more just and humane society or to something far darker depends on the choices we make now. The future is not written, and the collapse of capitalism is not the end of civilization. It is the beginning of something new. The only question left is what will we create in its place?